Richard thought he had the world in his hands. A beautiful, pregnant wife, a blooming career, and a secret life that made him feel invincible. But in room 402 of St. Jude's Memorial, these two worlds collided with a force no one could have anticipated. When his mistress, Jasmine, raised her hand and struck his bedridden, vulnerable wife, Richard did the unthinkable. He stood still. He didn't move to protect Selina, the mother of his unborn child, nor did he cast out the woman who had just violated the sanctity of that room. He thought his silence was a form of protection, a way to keep the peace until he could usher the chaos away. He didn't realize that the man standing in the shadows of the doorway wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was Sterling, the billionaire father-in-law Richard had spent 10 years trying to outsmart, and Sterling had just seen everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because to understand how a man could stand frozen while his life crumbled, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand who Richard really was before the money, before the affair, before the lies consumed him. We have to see the exact moment when ambition transformed into something darker, something uglier. This is not just a story about betrayal in a hospital room. This is the story of how a man systematically dismantled his own life, brick by brick, lie by lie, and how the people he thought he could manipulate were always 3 steps ahead. The Richard we know today, the one who stood silent while his pregnant wife was assaulted, didn't emerge from nowhere. He was constructed. Built from hunger, shaped by insecurity, and hardened by a decade of playing a role he was never quite sure he deserved. To truly understand the magnitude of his fall, we have to understand the architecture of his rise. We have to go back 10 years, to a time when Richard was nobody. He was a mid-level analyst at a mid-tier investment firm, making decent money but nothing that would turn heads at the kind of charity galas where the real elite congregated. He was competent, driven, and utterly forgettable. His apartment was in a neighborhood that was trying to be hip but hadn't quite arrived. His car was a reliable Japanese sedan, nothing that drew admiration. His dating life consisted of forgettable women from online dating apps and work functions. He was the kind of man who ordered the second cheapest bottle of wine at restaurants, who flew coach when he had to travel for work, who wore suits from discount department stores. He was successful by most measures, but he was haunted by a terrible awareness that success was all he had. He had no family fortune to fall back on. He had no connections that mattered. He had built everything through intelligence and hard work, and it was never enough. He came from a middle-class background in Connecticut. His father had been an accountant, respectable and hardworking but never wealthy. His mother had taught high school English. They had given him a good education, encouraged his ambition, and taught him that if he worked hard enough, he could achieve anything. But what they hadn't taught him was how to navigate a world where some people were simply born into access. He applied to Ivy League universities and was rejected. He applied to prestigious MBA programs and was put on waiting lists. He got into good schools but not the best schools. He worked his way into the world of high finance through sheer determination, always aware that he was slightly behind, always playing catch-up, always aware that there were people in the same room who had started with advantages he would never have. So when Richard walked into that charity fundraiser at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan, he was a man primed for transformation. He had worked his way into a position where he could attend these events, but he was always on the periphery. He was always the man trying to appear comfortable in a world that had never been comfortable with him. He wore his best suit, a Hugo Boss that he had purchased at a significant discount. He had practiced his conversation skills. He had memorized talking points about art and finance and the theater. He was performing, always performing. And then he saw Selina. Selina was not just beautiful. She was the kind of beautiful that came with a pedigree, a fortune, and the unmistakable confidence of a woman who had never been told no in her life. She was the only child of Sterling, a man whose name alone could move markets. When Richard first saw her across that ballroom, he wasn't thinking about love. He was thinking about access. He was thinking about doors that would open, opportunities that would materialize, and a life that would suddenly make sense. Their courtship was brief but intensive. Richard was charming in a way that felt almost rehearsed. He asked the right questions. He laughed at Sterling's jokes. He positioned himself as the kind of man who could be trusted, who could be groomed, who could be molded into the heir apparent that Sterling had never had. Sterling watched this unfold with the patience of a chess master. He didn't object to the relationship. He actually encouraged it, but his encouragement was measured, calculated, precisely calibrated to appear supportive while remaining fundamentally distant. He saw in Richard something that intrigued him, a hunger that matched his own, but without the foundation, without the breeding, without the unshakable confidence that comes from inherited wealth. Sterling had built his empire in a different era, when ruthlessness was valued and sentimentality was weakness. But he had also learned, through decades of navigating the treacherous waters of high finance, that the most dangerous men were the ones who came from nothing and had everything to prove. Richard was such a man. To Sterling, Richard was a test case. He wanted to see if a man could be given everything and still remain loyal. He wanted to see if ambition could be channeled into service, or if it would inevitably curdle into betrayal. He had seen it countless times in his career. Men who had been elevated beyond their station, who had been given access that they didn't earn, who had been allowed to sit at tables where decisions that affected thousands of lives were made. Some of them remained grateful, understanding that their elevation was a gift and not a right. Others began to resent the hand that had elevated them, began to believe that they had earned everything themselves, began to plot against their benefactors. Sterling wanted to know which kind of man Richard was. He couldn't know without testing him, and he intended to let that test play out over a full decade, long enough to see where Richard's true nature would reveal itself. The early years were intoxicating for Richard. He was given a vice presidency at Sterling's firm. He was handed a seat on the board of the family's primary investment vehicle. He was introduced to networks that had taken Sterling decades to build. He attended dinners where decisions that would affect thousands of lives were made over vintage wine and imported cigars. And through it all, Sterling watched. He watched how Richard performed in meetings. He watched how Richard treated the staff. He watched how Richard reacted when he was contradicted, when he was questioned, when his ideas were rejected in favor of more experienced voices. Sterling was cataloging every moment, building a psychological profile of the man his daughter had married. For the first 5 years, Richard played the part flawlessly. He was the doting husband. He was the respectful son-in-law. He was the ambitious but humble protege. He asked Sterling's advice before making major decisions. He credited Sterling's wisdom in front of the board. He seemed, to all external observers, to be exactly what Sterling wanted, a capable man who understood his place in the hierarchy, who recognized that his fortune was not earned but granted, and who would forever be indebted to the source of his elevation. But underneath this performance, something was shifting. Richard's resentment began as a whisper. It manifested in small ways. A glance that lasted slightly too long when Sterling corrected him in a meeting. A comment made to Selina in private about how Sterling still treated him like a child. A growing sense that his accomplishments were being diminished by the shadow of his father-in-law's legacy. The turning point came in the 5th year of their marriage, during a conversation in Sterling's private study. It was the kind of room that made lesser men feel small. Mahogany panels, leather-bound books that had never been read, and a desk that had been positioned to ensure the person sitting behind it always had the advantage of the light. Sterling poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed one to Richard. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured. He said something that Richard would spend years trying to forget and even longer trying to understand. He said, "Everything you have is a loan, Richard, and you should make sure I never feel the need to collect the interest." Richard laughed it off at the time. He interpreted it as the paternalistic wisdom of an aging patriarch trying to keep his heir in line. But the words had found their target. They had embedded themselves in Richard's psyche like a splinter that no amount of success could remove. From that moment forward, Richard began to see his marriage differently. He began to see Selena not as a partner, but as a tether. He began to resent the holidays spent with Sterling's extended family. He began to bristle at the way Sterling still had to approve major business decisions. He began to fantasize about a life where his success belonged entirely to him, where he didn't have to share the glory, where he didn't have to bow to anyone. This psychological shift was subtle but profound. It changed the way Richard moved through the world. It made him hungry in a different way. It made him willing to take risks that the old Richard, the grateful Richard, would never have considered. The embezzlement didn't start with grand larceny. It started small, the way most corruption does, with rationalizations and excuses that Richard allowed himself to believe. Richard discovered that certain accounts weren't monitored as closely as others. There were dormant accounts used primarily for historical record-keeping. There were shell companies that existed primarily for tax purposes. There were accounts that Sterling himself had set up decades earlier and had since forgotten about. Richard had access to all of them. His position as a senior executive meant that he could move money with minimal oversight. The first transfer was $5,000, moved from an account marked International Development Initiative to a private account in his name. He told himself he was testing the system. He told himself he was seeing if anyone was paying attention. He told himself that if he got caught, he could explain it away as a misunderstanding, a clerical error, a temporary loan that he would repay immediately. But he never got caught. And with each successful transfer, his confidence grew exponentially. 5,000 became 10,000. 10,000 became 25,000. He began to move money on a weekly basis. He opened multiple accounts in different names. He used corporate credit cards to purchase items that he then sold for cash. He began to justify the theft in increasingly creative ways. He deserved the money, he told himself. He had made Sterling billions of dollars through his work on various deals. He had sacrificed his integrity by playing the grateful son-in-law for nearly a decade. The money was compensation for the years of performing, of bowing and scraping, of pretending to be grateful for opportunities that he believed he had earned through his own brilliance. The money was justice. The money was rebalancing a cosmic equation that had been fundamentally unfair from the beginning. Around year 7 of his marriage, Richard met Jasmine at a luxury hotel event. She was not from his world. She was a former model trying to parlay her looks into a career in hospitality management. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was uncomplicated. She didn't ask questions about his family empire. She didn't understand the intricate web of obligations and inherited wealth that surrounded him. To Jasmine, Richard was simply a wealthy, powerful man with an easy smile and an endless supply of money. She represented everything his marriage to Selena was not. She represented freedom. She represented the illusion that he could be someone else, someone unencumbered by his past, someone who existed outside of Sterling's shadow. The affair began as a fantasy that Richard indulged in occasionally. A dinner here, a hotel room there. He was careful at first. He used aliases when booking reservations. He paid cash for incidental expenses. He maintained the fiction of business trips and extended meetings. But as the affair deepened, Richard's caution began to erode. He started to believe that he was clever enough to maintain both lives simultaneously. He rented an apartment in the city under a corporate shell, furnishing it with art and wine that Jasmine admired. He began to buy her gifts with increasingly reckless abandon. Designer handbags, diamond earrings, a custom-made fur coat that cost more than most people's annual salary, and he paid for it all with money that didn't belong to him. Selena noticed the changes in Richard, but she didn't confront him directly. Instead, she did something far more calculated and far more patient. She began to watch. She asked subtle questions about his whereabouts. She monitored his credit card statements, pulling monthly reports and reviewing each transaction. She kept a notebook where she recorded inconsistencies in his story. He said he was at the office on a Tuesday night, but his credit card was swiped at a hotel in Tribeca. He said he had a business dinner in the financial district, but his car's GPS showed him parked for hours in a residential neighborhood downtown. She noted all of it. She documented everything. She even hired a private investigator, not because she wanted confirmation of what she already suspected, but because she wanted documentation that would be irrefutable in a court of law. The investigator's reports began to arrive in her email with increasing frequency. Photographs of Richard entering a luxury apartment building with a woman who wasn't his wife. Photographs of him sitting in restaurants with this woman, his hand touching hers across the table. Photographs of him leaving hotels in the early morning hours, straightening his tie as he walked out. Financial records showing consistent payments to companies that Selena couldn't identify. Rental agreements for an apartment that Richard was maintaining in secret. Each report was another brick in a wall that was being constructed around her husband, a wall that would eventually trap him completely. But Selena didn't fall apart. She didn't cry or rage or confront him. Instead, something inside her crystallized. She had been raised by Sterling, a man for whom emotion was a commodity to be controlled and deployed strategically. She had learned at her father's knee that weakness was the greatest vulnerability. She understood that anger clouds judgment, and that sentiment often leads to poor decisions. She decided that she would not become the betrayed, heartbroken wife. She would become the architect of her husband's destruction. She would gather the evidence. She would document every transgression. And when the moment was right, when she had accumulated enough proof to make his defense impossible, she would strike. By the time she discovered the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, discovered the systematic embezzlement that had been ongoing for years, discovered the secret apartment and the mistress, and the jewelry purchases and the private jet trips, Selena had already begun to think like her father. She had already started to plan with the kind of precision that Sterling himself would have admired. She understood that her husband had not just betrayed her emotionally. He had betrayed the family legacy. He had planned to abandon his unborn child. He had plotted to destroy the business that Sterling had built over decades. 6 months before the hospital incident, Selena made a decision that would ultimately determine the course of her family's future. She authorized a forensic audit of Richard's financial activities. Not an official one, mind you. That would tip him off. Instead, she hired investigators through a series of intermediaries, creating a chain of distance between herself and the inquiry. She told her father nothing, though Sterling, with his preternatural instinct for deception, began to suspect something was wrong. He noticed the tension between Richard and Selena. He observed the way Selena's conversations with him had become more guarded, more strategic, and he understood, without being told, that his daughter had discovered something that required decisive action. The investigators Selena hired were the best in the business. They were the kind of people who found money that people had hidden in Swiss accounts and Russian banks. They were forensic accountants who could trace a digital trail backward through a maze of shell companies and dummy corporations. What they uncovered was far worse than simple infidelity. They discovered that Richard had been systematically stealing from the firm for years. They found the offshore accounts. They documented his relationship with Jasmine in meticulous detail. They recovered deleted emails that outlined plans for Richard to flee the country with his mistress after the baby was born. And most damning of all, they discovered the contract. The unsigned, preliminary contract between Richard and a foreign competitor to sell Sterling's proprietary patents, the core intellectual property of the entire empire, in exchange for a $50 million payout. Selena reviewed all of this documentation alone in her lawyer's office, and something inside her crystallized. She wasn't angry, not in the way most women would be. She was cold. She was calculating. She understood that her husband had not just betrayed her. He had betrayed the legacy that her father had built over decades. He had planned to abandon their unborn child. He had plotted to destroy the family business from the inside. And now, armed with this knowledge, she faced a choice. She could confront him directly and watch him scramble to explain himself, or she could wait. She could let him dig deeper into his own grave, gathering more evidence, exposing himself further until the moment of reckoning became inevitable. Selena chose to wait. She chose to play the role of the devoted wife. She went to the doctor's appointments. She discussed names for the baby. She acted as though nothing had changed, all while the investigation deepened, all while the evidence accumulated. She did this not out of weakness, but out of a profound understanding that revenge, true revenge, required patience. It required an understanding of leverage. It required knowing exactly when to strike so that there would be no possibility of escape, no chance of redemption, no room for second chances. Sterling noticed this shift in his daughter. He saw the coldness in her eyes when she looked at Richard, and he began to prepare his own contingencies, his own plans, his own nuclear option that had been in development since the day Richard married into the family. By the 8th month of Selina's pregnancy, everything was in place. The forensic audit was complete. The evidence was organized. Selina's legal team had prepared documents that would allow her to dissolve the marriage without giving Richard access to any of the family assets. Sterling had begun to position moves in the business world that would isolate Richard, that would cut off his access to credit, that would make him professionally untouchable. And Jasmine, unaware that she was being watched, continued in her delusion that Richard would eventually leave Selina and run away with her. She had no idea that every text message she sent to Richard, every photo she shared, every plan she discussed with him, was being cataloged and stored by Sterling's security apparatus. When Selina was rushed to the hospital with severe pregnancy complications, the timeline accelerated dramatically. The doctors used words like placental abruption and premature labor risk and complete bed rest, words that made Richard's blood run cold even as he tried to maintain his composure in front of the medical staff. Selina was confined to room 402, a private room on the obstetrics wing that overlooked the city. The room was monitored by machines that tracked the baby's heart rate and her own vital signs in real time. The monitors beeped in a rhythm that became the soundtrack to her confinement, a constant reminder of the fragility of the life that was developing inside her. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear. The lighting was soft, designed to be calming, but it only emphasized the seriousness of her condition. The walls were painted a pale blue that was meant to be soothing, but instead felt cold and clinical. There was a window that overlooked the city, but Selina spent most of her time staring at the ceiling, understanding with each passing hour that her body had turned against her, that the baby she wanted so badly was now at risk, that everything she had planned and prepared for might be taken away from her in an instant. Richard visited dutifully. He held her hand. He brought flowers, which the nurses had to place in a vase because Selina couldn't get out of bed to arrange them herself. He talked about the nursery he was planning to decorate, about the names they had discussed, about the future they would have together. He was performing the role of the devoted husband, and he was performing it well. But Selina could see the distraction in his eyes. She could sense the way he was checking his phone more frequently, the way his attention would drift away from her, the way his conversations would become stilted when his phone buzzed with messages from Jasmine. She knew he was maintaining his double life. She knew he was torn between two worlds, and she understood with perfect clarity which world he preferred. Jasmine, meanwhile, was reaching a critical breaking point. She had been waiting for months for Richard to make good on his promises. She was tired of being the secret. She was tired of the hotel rooms and the carefully timed phone calls. She was tired of the lies he told her about his wife, lies designed to make Selina sound cold and distant and unworthy of his affection. She had been to the apartment he was supposedly setting up. She had seen the photographs of the penthouse he was planning to buy with money that would come from sources he had never fully explained. She had heard him talk about the life they would have together, the vacations they would take, the freedom they would experience once he was finally free of his obligations to Sterling and his family. But weeks kept passing, and he kept delaying. He kept saying that he needed to wait until after the baby was born, until things settled down, until the timing was right. He said he needed to give Selina time to recover from the pregnancy, that she was fragile right now, that he didn't want to devastate her while she was vulnerable. From Jasmine's perspective, Richard was stringing her along. She didn't understand that he was trapped, caught between the woman he had married and the woman he was using as an escape valve for his desires. She didn't understand that he was terrified of being exposed. She didn't understand that he was trying to have it both ways, maintaining his marriage and his position in Sterling's world while also indulging his fantasy of a life with her. She only understood that she was being kept waiting, and that the longer she waited, the less likely it seemed that he would actually leave. She decided to force his hand. She would take action. She obtained a forged hospital pass using a credential that Richard had carelessly left at the penthouse weeks earlier. She had kept it, understanding at some level that it might become useful someday. She drove to St. Jude's Memorial on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in all black to minimize her visibility, and walked through the main entrance as though she belonged there. She knew the building layout. She had been there before on visits when Richard had snuck away to meet her in empty conference rooms and stairwells. She found her way to the obstetrics wing. She was wearing sunglasses despite the indoor lighting, a deliberate choice to emphasize her difference, to make herself feel like she was in disguise, to maintain the illusion that she could move through this hospital without being noticed. She found room 402 and let herself in, her heart pounding in her chest. She expected to find Selena sedated, weak, vulnerable. She expected to find a woman who was broken by her pregnancy complications, who would be terrified by Jasmine's presence, who might even beg for mercy or for Richard to choose. Instead, she found a woman awake and alert. She found a woman whose eyes were clear and whose mind was sharp, despite her physical confinement. Selena didn't cry. She didn't express shock or fear. She didn't even express anger. She simply looked at her husband's mistress and waited to see what would happen next. There was something in Selena's composure that unnerved Jasmine. There was something in the way Selena's eyes tracked her movement that suggested Selena had been expecting her, had perhaps even been waiting for her to make this exact move. Richard's paralysis in that moment was not the result of shock or indecision. It was the manifestation of a truth that had been building inside him for years. He had spent a decade trying to outsmart Sterling. He had convinced himself that he was clever enough, shrewd enough, ruthless enough to build his own empire within Sterling's empire. He had believed that his affairs, his embezzlement, his plans to sell company secrets were hidden from view. And in that moment, standing between his pregnant wife and his mistress, he finally understood the full scope of his delusion. He was not a player in this game. He was a piece on Sterling's board. And Sterling had been moving him into checkmate since the day they met. He didn't see Sterling standing in the doorway. He was too focused on the women in front of him, too consumed with the terrible reality that his double life was about to implode. But Sterling was there. Sterling had been monitoring Richard's movements for months. Sterling had known about the planned hospital visit. Sterling had positioned himself to witness the exact moment when Richard's moral character would be fully exposed. And as Richard stood there, frozen in his guilt and his shame, Sterling stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't express anger or disappointment. He simply said 4 words that would echo in Richard's mind for the rest of his life. "Check your phone." As Richard pulled the device from his pocket with trembling fingers, he began to understand the true meaning of defeat. His phone was exploding with notifications. The headlines were already appearing on Bloomberg, Reuters, and every major financial news outlet. The SEC was issuing a statement. His board seats were being revoked. The firm had issued a press release distancing itself from him. Photos were being released, photographs that he thought were encrypted and buried in hidden folders. His double life was being broadcast to the world in real time. Sterling hadn't just discovered Richard's betrayal. He had weaponized it. He had timed it. He had orchestrated a takedown that would dismantle Richard's entire existence in a matter of minutes. The medical staff began to filter into the room, alerted by the commotion. Sterling waved them away with a gesture. He was the chairman of the hospital, a fact that Richard had somehow forgotten in the chaos of his own corruption. Sterling walked over to Selena's bedside and took her hand gently. His demeanor shifted from cold executioner to protective father. It was a performance, yes, but it was a performance so masterful that no one in the room could doubt its authenticity. He didn't even look at Jasmine, who was now realizing that her grand gesture of forcing Richard's hand had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. She had thought she was playing chess. She had not realized she was being played. Sterling looked at Richard one last time before the security team arrived. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. "You thought you were playing chess, Richard, but you were just a piece on my board, and I've decided I don't like how you move." The security detail, Sterling's private team, moved forward and began to escort Richard and Jasmine out of the wing. Richard didn't resist. He couldn't. He had been broken in the span of 5 minutes. He had gone from a man who believed himself untouchable to a man who understood, with crystalline clarity, that every move he had made had been anticipated, documented, and prepared for. As Richard stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital, the cool night air hitting his face, the reality of his situation began to settle into his bones. He had no car. The company sedan had been remotely disabled and reported stolen. He had no access to his corporate accounts. His credit cards were being declined. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications about his suspension from the firm. A message from the firm's lead counsel informed him that his employment was being terminated effective immediately, and that his access to all company property was revoked. In less than an hour, Richard had transformed from a high-level executive to a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. But while Richard stood on that sidewalk, reeling from the sudden, catastrophic loss of everything he thought he was, the machinery of Sterling's revenge was accelerating. A team of forensic investigators, the best in the country, had already begun moving through Richard's office. They weren't looking for a reason to fire him. They were looking for ammunition to destroy him completely. Sterling had known for years that Richard was skimming from the firm, but he had allowed the debt to grow, waiting for the moment when the interest would be so astronomical that Richard could never pay it back. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the systematic betrayal of a legacy. It was about Richard's attempt to steal the intellectual property that Sterling had spent decades accumulating. The lead investigator, a man who had spent 30 years finding money that people tried to hide in every corner of the world, sat at Richard's desk and began to pull the thread. What he found wasn't just thousands of dollars. It was a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to fund a lifestyle that Richard could never have afforded on his salary alone. There was the penthouse apartment in the city, paid for through a corporate alias. There were the jewelry purchases, the luxury vacations, the fleet of cars leased under different names. There was documentation of every single transaction, a digital footprint so massive that Richard might as well have left a trail of breadcrumbs directly to his crimes. The investigation moved with terrifying speed. Every email Richard had ever sent was recovered and reviewed. Every text message he thought was deleted was reconstructed from backup servers. Every luxury purchase he had made for Jasmine was cross-referenced with his bank accounts and matched to specific dates when he claimed to be working. The picture that emerged was not just of a man having an affair. It was the picture of a man who was systematically dismantling his own family to feed his ego and his lust. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on jewelry, private jets, and the apartment, all while Selena was at home, planning their future, carrying his unborn child. But there was a deeper layer to the deception that made even the most seasoned investigators pause. As the forensic team dug deeper into the bank transfers, they began to piece together a conspiracy so comprehensive, so calculated, that it went beyond simple infidelity. Richard wasn't just stealing for himself. He was attempting to build a rival firm using Sterling's own trade secrets and client lists. He had been accessing confidential files, copying proprietary information, and planning to pitch himself to venture capital firms as the founder of a new company. He had even begun preliminary negotiations with foreign competitors to sell Sterling's primary patents. He wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a corporate spy operating within his own family, a Trojan horse that Sterling had allowed to walk through the gates. Jasmine, meanwhile, was discovering that being the mistress of a powerful man only worked when that man actually retained his power. Within 48 hours of the hospital incident, she was served with an eviction notice for the penthouse apartment. The legal team that arrived at her door was efficient and brutal. Her belongings were removed from the premises and placed in storage. She found herself locked out of the life she had believed Richard was building for them. When she tried to reach out to the friends she had made in the social circles that Richard frequented, she found only dial tones and blocked numbers. Sterling had made sure that her name was as toxic as Richard's. No one in that world would acknowledge her. No one would return her calls. Desperate and increasingly panicked, Jasmine played what she thought was her final card. She released a statement through a low-tier tabloid claiming that she was pregnant with Richard's child and that Sterling's team was trying to silence her. She believed this would give her leverage, a seat at the negotiating table, or at least a significant financial settlement. She was counting on the publicity to force Sterling's hand, to make him realize that he had to deal with her on some level. She didn't realize that Sterling had already obtained her medical records through a perfectly legal loophole in her lease agreement with the penthouse. The records were conclusive. Jasmine had undergone a procedure 8 months prior that made her pregnancy claim a physical impossibility. Sterling didn't respond to her claim publicly. He didn't dignify it with a statement or a denial. Instead, he had his legal team send the medical evidence to Jasmine's lawyer, along with a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive that she would be financially destroyed if she ever spoke about Richard, Sterling, or the family again. They also purchased her a one-way ticket out of the state and made it clear that if she didn't take it, the consequences would be severe. Within a week, Jasmine had vanished. She left the apartment with nothing but a suitcase, and she drove out of the city in the early morning hours, a cautionary tale of what happened when you tried to leverage your way into the inner circle of a billionaire empire. Her exit from the story was as quiet and pathetic as her entrance into the hospital had been loud and chaotic. Richard's isolation was now total. He tried to check into a hotel, but his credit cards were declined. He tried to call his mother, only to find that Sterling had already spoken to her, explaining the full extent of Richard's embezzlement and the danger he had put Selena and the unborn baby in. Even his own family couldn't look him in the eye. His brother, who worked in a different field entirely, received a call from Sterling's team suggesting that any continued association with Richard would have professional consequences. His childhood friends were warned away through whisper campaigns. Sterling had the resources and the will to ensure that Richard became invisible, not just professionally but socially. He spent his nights in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, in a room that smelled like stale cigarettes and desperation. He watched the news reports of his downfall playing on a television with a cracked screen. The same journalists who had once praised his visionary leadership and written flattering profiles about him were now dissecting his failures, labeling him a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. He was no longer Richard the Titan. He was Richard the thief. He was Richard the betrayer. He was Richard the man who couldn't keep his own family together. The paper trail finally led back to the most devastating piece of evidence of all. The investigators found a safe deposit box that Richard had rented under a false name. Inside was a signed contract, preliminary but detailed, outlining a deal with a foreign competitor to sell Sterling's primary patents. The agreement specified payment of a $50 million wire transferred directly into an account in the Cayman Islands. Richard had planned to take this money and disappear. He had planned to leave Selena right after the baby was born, abandoning his newborn son and his pregnant wife, and starting a new life with Jasmine somewhere in South America or Southeast Asia. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't the result of a man being corrupted by his desires. This was premeditated. This was calculated. This was a deliberate, methodical plan to betray everyone who had ever shown him kindness. When Sterling saw that contract, something shifted in him. The last flicker of mercy, the small part of him that might have been swayed by appeals to family loyalty or the bonds of blood, vanished completely. The investigation was over. The documentation was complete. It was time for the execution. Sterling didn't go to the authorities immediately. First, he wanted to give Richard a choice. He wanted to give his daughter's husband one final opportunity to make a decision, to see if Richard was capable of understanding the magnitude of what he had done, to see if there was any possibility of redemption, or if Richard was simply a soulless opportunist who deserved everything that was coming to him. The morning of the final meeting, the air in the city felt unusually still. Richard arrived at the headquarters of Sterling's global empire in a taxi he had paid for with the last crumpled bills in his pocket. The building was a monument to wealth and power, a glass and steel tower that stretched 40 stories into the sky. Richard looked up at it as he exited the cab, and he remembered the day Sterling had first brought him to this building, introduced him around as his son-in-law, made it clear that this was the kingdom Richard was now part of. Today it looked like a fortress designed specifically to keep him out. He was no longer welcome here. He was no longer part of this world. He was an intruder now, a thief, a man who had tried to steal what didn't belong to him. When he reached the lobby, the receptionist, who used to brighten visibly when Richard entered, didn't even acknowledge him. She had been instructed to ignore him. Two burly men in dark suits, members of Sterling's private security detail, stepped forward. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. They simply gestured toward the freight elevator, the service elevator, the one used by delivery people and maintenance staff. Richard understood the message. He wasn't being treated like an executive. He was being treated like a security threat. He was being removed from the building, physically and symbolically, and there was nothing he could do about it. The boardroom was silent as Richard was escorted inside. The long mahogany table, where Richard had sat in meetings for the last decade, was now an arena. At the far end sat Sterling, his face unreadable, his hands steepled in front of him. Beside him was a team of 12 lawyers, their briefcases open like sets of jagged teeth. Richard recognized some of them. He had worked with some of them on mergers and acquisitions. Now they were arrayed against him like a jury ready to render judgment. But it was the person sitting to Sterling's left that made Richard's heart stop completely. It was Selina. She was pale, and she was sitting in a wheelchair, but her eyes were clear and filled with a cold, hard light Richard had never seen before. She didn't look like the woman he had left in the hospital bed. She looked like a queen who had just survived an assassination attempt and was now ready to sign the death warrant of the traitor who had tried to destroy her. She looked exactly like her father. For the first time, Richard understood that Selina had never been the weak link. She had never been the victim waiting to be rescued. She had been his equal or perhaps his superior all along. She had simply been patient, waiting for him to reveal himself completely. Sterling didn't offer Richard a seat. Instead, he pushed a thick stack of documents across the table. The stack was inches thick, hundreds of pages of compiled evidence, photographs, bank statements, emails, and forensic analysis. Sterling's voice was devoid of emotion, which made it far more terrifying than if he had shouted, if he had expressed rage, if he had given Richard any indication that he still viewed him as human. Sterling said, "You have two choices, Richard. You can sign these papers, which include a full confession of your embezzlement, the transfer of every asset you currently hold back to the family estate, a complete relinquishment of your claims to company stock and future earnings, and a permanent restraining order against my daughter and my grandchild. In exchange, I will not hand the files we've collected to the federal prosecutors. You will walk out of here with your freedom and absolutely nothing else." Or, he paused. He let the silence fill the room. He let Richard contemplate what was about to come next. "Or," Sterling continued, "you can refuse to sign. You can walk out of this room with your dignity intact if you still have any. And I will hand everything we have to the FBI, the SEC, the IRS, and every other federal agency that specializes in prosecuting financial crimes. We have documented 42 separate counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. You will leave this building in handcuffs, Richard. You won't be living in a cheap motel. You'll be living in a federal cell for the next 25 years. You'll miss the birth of your child. You'll miss his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. You'll miss the next 2 decades of his life. And I will personally make sure that every inmate in that facility knows exactly why you're there." Richard looked at the lawyers. He looked at the documents. He looked at Selena, hoping for a flicker of mercy, hoping that some part of her still loved him, still saw him as the man she had married. But she simply looked away. She had made her decision long ago. She was here not to save him, but to witness his fall. With a hand that shook so violently he could barely hold the pen, Richard began to sign. Page after page of his life was stripped away. The deed to the estate was transferred back to Sterling. The offshore accounts were liquidated and returned to the family. The stock options were forfeited. With every signature, he felt himself becoming smaller, more insignificant. He was signing away the identity he had spent 10 years building on a foundation of lies. When the final page was turned, Sterling stood up and took the pen from Richard's hand. He handed it to Selena. With a steady hand, she signed the divorce papers, officially severing the final tie that bound her to the man who had stood by while she was assaulted in her hospital bed. The sound of the pen meeting paper was like the fall of a judge's gavel. It was final. It was irrevocable. It was the end of their marriage, the end of Richard's claims on his child, the end of everything. The execution was complete. Sterling signaled to the security detail, who stepped forward. They didn't need to escort Richard out. He understood that he was no longer welcome in this building, in this world, in the life he had constructed for himself. But before they could move him, Selena spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the entire room. Every lawyer, every security guard, every person present fell silent to listen to what she had to say. She said, "You thought you were the one who held the power, Richard. You thought my father was the only thing standing in your way, but you forgot that I am my father's daughter. I knew about the account 6 months ago. I was the one who authorized the forensic audit. I was waiting for you to prove me wrong. I was waiting for you to show me that you actually cared about us, that you were capable of change, that you could be the man I thought I had married. But you couldn't even do that. You dug deeper. You lied more. You planned to abandon your son before he even took his first breath." Richard realized then that the nuclear option wasn't just Sterling's wealth. It wasn't just the power of a billionaire who had built an empire. The nuclear option was Selena's strength. It was her intelligence. It was her willingness to play the long game, to gather the evidence, to prepare the case, and to strike at exactly the moment when there was no possibility of escape. He was led out of the room, past the offices of people who wouldn't even look at him, past the desks of assistants who had once brought him coffee. He was pushed out into the street, literally and figuratively, a man with $0 and a name that had become a curse. The transition from a life of absolute luxury to one of absolute anonymity is not a sudden drop. It is a slow, agonizing realization that stretches across days and weeks and months, each one slightly more desperate than the last. 1 year after the doors of Sterling's empire were slammed shut in his face, Richard finds himself sitting in a small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of a city that has long since forgotten his name. The apartment is in a building where no one asks questions, a 5-story walk-up in a neighborhood that is neither safe nor particularly dangerous, just utterly indifferent. The walls are thin enough that he can hear every conversation his neighbors have, every television they watch, every moment of domestic joy or conflict that plays out in the adjacent units. The walls are also thin enough that his neighbors can hear him, but there is rarely anything to hear. He is silent in his apartment. He moves quietly. He leaves no trace of himself. The plumbing is unreliable. The heating system works only sporadically. The windows are old and don't seal properly, so cold air enters the apartment in the winter regardless of how much heat he tries to generate. He has learned to dress in layers, to keep a blanket draped across his shoulders even in the small bedroom. The neighbors are people who are themselves invisible, people who have fallen through the cracks of society, people who are trying to rebuild something resembling a life from the fragments they have left. They are nursing mothers working double shifts to keep their children fed. They are elderly people living on fixed incomes, stretching their social security checks to cover rent and medication. They are the working poor and the unemployed, the overlooked and the unwanted. And now, Richard is one of them. The designer suits have been replaced by off-the-rack clothes bought at department store clearance sales and thrift shops. He has 2 pairs of jeans, both faded and worn. He has 3 shirts that no longer fit him quite right because he has lost weight from stress and poor nutrition. The high-stakes meetings with board members and venture capitalists have been replaced by a quiet, desperate search for any kind of employment that doesn't require a background check. He has learned that his name comes up when employers search for him online. He has learned that the headlines about his disgrace follow him everywhere, that the articles describing his embezzlement and his affair are the first things anyone finds when they Google his name. He works cash jobs when he can find them. He has delivered packages for a gig service, standing in the rain and heat, learning the layout of a neighborhood he had never visited before. He has cleaned office buildings at night when the regular employees have gone home, pushing a vacuum across carpets in spaces that had once been familiar to him, spaces where people he used to work with were still climbing the corporate ladder while he was on his hands and knees, cleaning up their coffee spills and their paper waste. He has done the kinds of work that no one who knew him before would ever imagine him doing. He has stocked shelves in grocery stores. He has washed cars. He has worked as a temporary data entry clerk, entering information into computers for medical offices and insurance companies, mind-numbing work that required no skill and offered no hope of advancement. Every time he sees a headline about Sterling's firm, every time he reads about a successful merger or acquisition that his name would have been attached to a year ago, he feels the ghost of the life he threw away. He has a Google alert set for the company, a masochistic habit he cannot break. Notifications arrive on his phone with news of promotions and new hires and record-breaking quarters. The people who had been his peers are now his superiors. The people he had managed are now his managers. The company he had helped to build is thriving without him, moving forward, completely indifferent to the hole his departure left. He is a man who had everything, a legacy, a family, a future, and he traded it for the temporary thrill of a secret and the shallow promises of a woman who was never truly there for him. He knew intellectually that Jasmine was never going to run away with him to South America or Southeast Asia. He knew on some level that she didn't love him, that she was attracted only to the money and the status. But he had needed to believe the lie. He had needed the fantasy to justify the theft, the deception, the betrayal. And now, with the fantasy demolished and the money gone, he was left with nothing but the truth, that he had destroyed his own life for illusions. The gut punch of Richard's new reality is most visible on the Sunday mornings he spends walking past the park near the estate he once called home. He doesn't go there intentionally. He tells himself it's a shortcut, a more efficient route between his apartment and the store where he buys his groceries. But it's not a shortcut. There are 3 other routes he could take that would be equally efficient, perhaps even more so. He goes to the park because he cannot stop himself. It is compulsion. It is the psychological need to witness the life that continues without him, the life that should have been his, the life that was taken from him, or that he gave away, depending on how charitable he is feeling toward himself on any given day. From a distance, hidden behind a line of trees, he sees what should have been his future. He has timed these visits. He knows that Selena and Sterling take the baby to the park every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. He arrives at 9:45, positioning himself where he has a clear view but where he is unlikely to be noticed. He watches Selena, who looks stronger and more vibrant than she ever did during their marriage. She is not the same woman who lay in a hospital bed, dependent and vulnerable. She has been transformed by what she endured, hardened and empowered. She is wearing clothes that fit her perfectly, clothes that cost money, clothes that reflect her status. She is pushing a stroller, but she is not the tired, overwhelmed mother he imagines. She is a woman who has regained control of her life. Beside her is Sterling, no longer the cold executor who dismantled his son-in-law's career, but a grandfather who looks at the child in the stroller with a tenderness that Richard never bothered to cultivate. Sterling is smiling. Sterling is laughing. Sterling is pointing out birds in the trees to the baby, explaining the world to his grandchild in a way that Richard can partially hear from his hiding place. They are a complete unit, a family protected by the very wealth and power that Richard tried to subvert, a family made stronger by the betrayal they survived. The baby is a boy, healthy and strong and beautiful in the way that all Bobbies are. Richard watches him and feels nothing but hollow emptiness. The boy is his son, born while Richard was in hiding, born into a world where his father was a disgrace, a cautionary tale, a name that was never mentioned with anything other than contempt. The boy's first memories will not include Richard. The boy will grow up hearing stories about his grandfather's strength and his mother's courage, but his father will be a blank space, an absence rather than a presence. He watches them from the shadows, a stranger to his own blood, a man watching his own son play with his own father-in-law while remaining completely outside of that circle. The realization hits him with each passing week that the nuclear option wasn't just a legal maneuver, wasn't just Sterling's willingness to destroy him professionally and financially. The nuclear option was the total extraction of his existence from their history. The nuclear option was rendering him so completely erased that even his biological connection to his son would mean nothing, because his son would never know him, would never think of him, would never wonder about him. Selina's recovery in the year since the hospital incident was not just physical. She didn't retreat into the role of the wounded wife. She didn't fade into the background, nursing her pain in private. Instead, she stepped into a leadership role within Sterling's foundation, focusing specifically on maternal health and legal protections for women in vulnerable positions. She channeled her betrayal into purpose. She became an advocate for women in situations similar to her own, women trapped in marriages with men who didn't respect them, who didn't protect them, who chose their own desires over the safety of their families. She established a legal fund to help women obtain restraining orders. She created educational programs to help women recognize the early signs of infidelity and financial abuse. She used her resources and her platform to transform her own trauma into a force for good in the world. To the outside world, Richard is a footnote. He is a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of elite business schools. He is the case study that professors use to illustrate what happens when ambition is left unchecked by conscience. Business school students read about his fall in case studies and wonder how a man could be so foolish, so greedy, so blind to his own failings. To Selina and Sterling, he is simply a ghost, a reminder that the strongest fortresses are built not on money, not on power, not on the inheritance of wealth, but on loyalty, on character, on the willingness to sacrifice for family. Sterling looks at his grandson and sees the future. He sees a boy who will grow up understanding that loyalty is the only currency that truly keeps its value. Power, as Richard learned in the hardest possible way, is not what you earn through deception. It is not what you accumulate in secret. Power is what you deserve through character. Power is what you build through integrity. Richard believed that he could bite the hand that fed him and still expect to be invited to the table. He believed that his cleverness, his charm, his ambition would be enough to shield him from the consequences of his betrayal. He didn't understand that Sterling's world was built on a code of honor that Richard was never capable of following. He didn't understand that Selina was playing a game that was far more sophisticated than his own. As the sun sets on his small apartment, the only thing Richard has left is silence. The same silence he chose when Jasmine struck his wife. It is a heavy, permanent silence that serves as his only companion. He is the architect of his own isolation, living out a sentence that no prison could ever enforce. It is the sentence of knowing exactly what he lost and knowing exactly why he deserved to lose it. He lost a family. He lost a career. He lost a future. He lost the respect of everyone who ever knew him. He lost the childhood memories he will never have with his son. He lost it all because he believed he was clever enough to outsmart a billionaire, clever enough to hide a double life, clever enough to steal from people who had given him everything. This story proves that in the high-stakes world of empires and legacies, loyalty is the only currency that truly keeps its value. Money can be made and lost. Power can shift with circumstances. Influence can fade with time. But loyalty endures. It is the foundation upon which real dynasties are built. Richard had an opportunity to be part of something greater than himself. He had an opportunity to be loyal to a family that had welcomed him, that had given him access to resources and opportunities that most people will never have. He threw that opportunity away for a woman who didn't love him, for money that didn't belong to him, for a lie that was always going to be exposed. If you had been in Sterling's shoes, would you have ended Richard's career with such surgical precision, or would you have left him a path to redemption for the sake of the family? Would you have chosen to protect your daughter with absolute ruthlessness, or would you have chosen to preserve the family unit at the cost of justice? Looking back at the red flags, it's clear that the betrayal started long before the hospital room. It started the moment Richard began to value his own ego over the people who made his life possible. It started when he first siphoned money into an offshore account. It started when he chose to hide his affair rather than confront his resentment. It started in the moment he decided that he was clever enough to maintain a double life without consequences. But was justice really served in the end, or was the cost to the family too high? Was Richard's complete destruction necessary, or would some form of mercy have been possible? We want to hear your thoughts on this. Leave a comment below and tell us what you would have done differently. Tell us whether you think Richard deserved what happened to him, or whether you believe Sterling went too far. Tell us what you think the breaking point was, the exact moment when Richard's fate became sealed. Tell us what you think about Selina's role in all of this. Was she justified in gathering evidence in secret? Was she justified in allowing Richard to dig deeper into his own grave before exposing him? Or was she complicit in his destruction, using the law as a weapon rather than as a shield? If you found this takedown of a corporate traitor satisfying, you won't believe our next story. We're going deep into the case of a tech CEO who tried to disappear after a $50 million fraud, thinking he was safe in a remote corner of the world, only to be tracked down and brought to justice by the one person he thought he could trust, his own daughter. It's a story of high-tech tracking, hidden identities, and a family betrayal that makes this one look like a warm-up act. The daughter becomes an avenging angel, using her technical expertise and her insider knowledge to hunt her father across continents and time zones. She doesn't go to the authorities. She takes justice into her own hands. It's a story of technology, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter that not even massive betrayal can sever completely. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.